error status code. In that case, we could set error to failed to fetch data, please try again later. Something like this. The exact error message, of course, is up to you. Now with that, you can then go down to your build method again, and there, at the very end, after all these other if checks, I want to add another if check and check if error is not equal to null, which you can check like this. And if that's the case, I know that I have an error, and in that case, I don't care about what I wanted to display as content, if it was the fallback or the progress indicator. I don't care about that. Instead, I want to render my error message. And for that, I'll copy this here and set content equal to this, but now the text here will be the error message stored in error, and therefore this can't be const anymore. Here, we should also add an exclamation mark, because we know that error won't be null, because that's literally what we're checking here. So with that, I'm setting my content of this screen to this error message if we have an error. Of course, now I just must make sure that in load items, where I'm setting error, I also call set state, because since I'm outputting the error in the UI, I also must make sure that the UI is updated if an error occurs. And we do that with set state, of course. And with that, if I save this and force a reload, now we get this error message here if things go wrong, and that's arguably, of course, a better user experience than what we had before. With that, I just want to add a dot. Here at the end. I'm happy with that, and we definitely improved the app. Now with that adjustment made, I will of course grab the correct URL again and use that again, because I don't want to break this app. Without HTTPS and this slash here, by the way, because I don't want to break this app, I just wanted to show you how you could handle errors. Of course, the default case here is that we don't have an error. So now with all of that, we can now load our items. So now with all these, now when sending, so now with all of that, we can now load our items. We can add new items. The missing piece, of course, is that we remove items. I mean, we can remove items, but if we then reload, they will be there again, because we only deleted them locally and not on our backend. That, of course, needs to change. And for that, we should go to this remove item method here in grocery list. And there we should send another HTTP request. Now it should, of course, be a delete request. request sent to a URL that's structured like this. And there's one special thing about that URL. It's the same URL as before, but at the end, we're pointing at a specific item in our Firebase database. A specific item by ID. So we have to include the ID of the item we want to delete in the URL, as you will see. Now for that here, we'll of course start by creating a URL. So we can copy this logic here from load items and add it to remove item. But now the URL must be adjusted. Now for that here, we'll be item by ID. So we have to include the ID of the item we want to delete in the URL, as you will see. Now for that here, we'll of course start by creating a URL. So we can copy this logic here from load items and add it to remove item. But now the URL must be adjusted. Instead of pointing at the overall shopping list, we want to point at a specific item in there, because we don't want to delete the entire shopping list, but just one item in the shopping list. That's why we have to add another slash here after shopping list to target a specific item in there. It's like working with a folder structure. We want to dive into the shopping list folder and then target one specific folder by name, so by ID here. And now the ID here, of course, depends on the item that was selected. So here I want to inject a value into the string, which we can still do because this is a regular string. We can use this injection syntax about which you learned earlier and target an item by ID. And since these IDs are loaded from Firebase, this should work just fine. So with that, we're targeting a specific item. And that will be important because next we'll use the HTTP package to send a delete request to this URL. Now, just like get, delete doesn't need a lot of configuration. You could add a body technically, and you can set headers, but we don't need to do any of that. We don't need any extra metadata, and there also is no extra request body attached to this request. Instead, we just send a delete request to this URL, and Firebase will do the rest. I then, of course, also still want to update my local state to also remove that item from the local list. I don't want to fetch the entire list again. I just want to remove that one item, which we deleted with this request, from the list. Now, we could add async await here to do that, but we actually don't even need to do that. I'm fine with not waiting for this before I update my local list, because the item can be deleted in the background. I don't need to wait for this request to finish to update my local list here. I had to wait when adding a new item because I needed that ID from the backend, but here for deleting, I don't need anything from the response. And therefore, we can delete it instantly without waiting for the response. And if we don't add a wait here, we also won't wait for it. Instead, this request will be sent, but will not wait for the response. And therefore, we should be good to go. With that, if I save that and reload, if I then wait for the data to load, Firebase was a bit slower here, and I then delete test, it's deleted locally, but also on the backend, as you can see here. It's highlighted in red, which is quite convenient, at least for a couple of seconds before it's then removed here. And if I now reload the app, we also won't see the test item here anymore. I mean, I have it here again, but if I delete this and maybe also chocolate, those items will be deleted, also from the backend. And if I then reload, those items will, well, stay deleted. Now, of course, things could go wrong when deleting. I could again have an invalid URL or an error that's beyond my control. And in that case, we have a problem because now I can delete items locally, but they're not deleted on Firebase because something went wrong with the request. And for that reason, we then, for example, could be surprised if we visit the app again and the item is back. Therefore, we actually might want to check for whether this request succeeds and undo this deletion and maybe show an error message to the user if we fail to delete the item. For this, I will convert this to async so that I can await this, but I will actually update my list before sending the request so that we don't unnecessarily wait here. But I then take a look at my response here, and if my response status code is greater or equal than 400, so I know that something went wrong, I want to undo this deletion. And I can undo it by calling setState again, and now adding that item back to my list. Now with add, I would of course add it in a different place, therefore I might want to get the index first, which I can get by reaching out to my list, and there index of item. And then here, instead of add, we could use insert to add item at a specific index. And that's the same approach we used earlier in the course with a snack bar and the undo option we had there. Because insert is a method built into Dart that can be used on any list to add an item at a specific index in that list. So that will undo the deletion if we have an error. And of course, we also might want to show an error message here with a scaffold messenger and a snack bar, for example. But here, I'll keep it a bit simpler and not do that and just undo the operation. So now if I delete this, it will eventually come back, as you see, because the deletion fails. But of course, it might be better to also show an error message here, but since this is nothing new and not directly related to HTTP, I'll simply skip this step here, but it is of course something you could do. And with that, I'll of course now fix this URL again to make sure that deleting does not work again, and we are using a valid URL. So now with all these new features added, we're almost done for this section. But there is one problem with this app. And to show this problem, I deleted all items but one, which I added. And if I now... So handling this note... So now with all of that... So now with all these new... No, avoiding... So now with all these new features added... So now with all these new features added, we're almost done for this section. But there's one problem with this app. And to show this problem, I deleted all items but one, which I added. And if I now also delete this last item, you will see that if I reload here, I'm stuck again in this loading spinner state. I don't see an error message, and I don't see the fallback text either. And we have this behavior here because we're actually facing an error here. An error which you can see in the debug console. This unhandled exception type null is not a subtype of type map error. Now we're getting this error here because in the end now I have no items left on my backend. But here in load items, I'm trying to decode my response body. So I'm trying to decode that data which I'm getting back from the backend. And I'm telling Dart that the decoded data will be a map where I have string keys and different kinds of values. The problem is that if I have no items on Firebase, response body won't yield such a map though. Instead, if I print response body here, and I restart the app, you will see that here it's of type null. This very first line here, it's of type null. So we got no data back. And that's why we're getting this error thereafter, because null, when decoded here, is not giving us a map. So therefore here, we should add an extra check and check if response body is equal null, which means we got no data from the backend. And in that case, I want to simply return and not execute any more code. Though I also want to do at least one thing before I return. I want to set my state and set is loading to false, because we're not loading anymore. We're done with that. We got a response. It doesn't have any data attached to it, but we still got a response. So we're done loading, and I therefore want to get rid of my loading spinner. But thereafter, we want to return to make sure that none of this code here executes, and we're not running into this error which we just saw. Now with that added, you actually learn though, if you hover over these blue squiggly lines, that response body can't possibly be null. And indeed, if I hover over body, it's always a string. There is no question mark after string, so this is never null. Now we saw null in the debug console because actually what Firebase does here is it returns the string null. So a string with the text null inside of it. So this logic here should be backend specific. Some backends might return an empty string. Others do something like Firebase and return null in a string. Yet others might use a certain response status code for which you want to check. For example, a 404 or anything like this status code. So it depends on the backend. For Firebase, it's this check here, which you want to add to make sure that we're getting rid of the loading indicator, but that we're not going through this logic here if we got no data from the backend. And with that, if we save that and reload, you see that now we only briefly had that loading indicator and then we see that fallback text. So adding this logic here was one thing I wanted to do.